Welcome to the first episode of What Happened to Prisoner Justice Day, a podcast mini-series about the history of prisons in Canada, focusing on differences in the prison system in the 1960s to 1980s versus today. The podcast features interviews with former and current prisoners, as well as supporters on the outside. For those new to prison history, Prisoner Justice Day, also called PJD, started in 1975 on the one-year anniversary of the death of Edward Nayland, an inside organizer who bled to death in a segregation cell in Millhaven Maximum Penitentiary on August 10, 1974. Prisoners refused to eat and refused to work to commemorate Eddie's death. In May 1976, Robert Landers, who had been actively organizing in Archambault Pen before being involuntarily transferred to Millhaven, died in a segregation cell in Millhaven after repeated calls for medical help met no response. The panic button in his cell had been deactivated. In June 1976, prisoners in Millhaven launched a call for support for their one-day hunger strike in remembrance of all prisoners who had died inside, to take place on August 10th. Word spread across the country, and in the end, thousands of prisoners participated in the one-day hunger strike, and supporters on the outside organized events on the outside. A lot has changed since the 1970s, not just in prison, but outside of prison. While respecting PJD remains an important thing for many on the inside and outside, the numbers of those participating are nowhere near the numbers involved in the 70s and 80s. This podcast miniseries sets out to explore why that change has occurred. In this first episode, we'll hear from Bob Gaucher, a retired professor at the University of Ottawa who was incarcerated in the 1960s and became an advocate for prisoners from the moment of his release until today. Bob talks to us about his experiences inside and explains more of the history of PJD and the era that led up to it. In the episode, Bob uses the acronym KP, which stands for Kingston Penitentiary, which opened in 1835 and closed its doors in 2013.
My name's Robert Gaucher, but I grew up out west, so everybody knows me as Bob Gaucher. I taught criminology at the University of Ottawa for almost 30 years. Prior to that, I was involved with many prison rights initiatives going back to the early 1960s.
Do you want to talk a bit about how you initially got involved in prisoner rights initiatives in the 60s?
When I was 16, I was sentenced to a year in jail, and I did it in an adult provincial prison. When I was 17, almost 18, I got a 2-year sentence and was sentenced to penitentiary. And that was a real eye-opener, being 17 years old, going into a maximum security penitentiary, the SAS Pen. It was a bit of a daunting experience. This was the age of penal reform. They were still going back and forth about whether or not they were actually going to try anything that seemed to be, quotation marks, rehabilitative, or whether or not it was just going to be the same old, same old. I had quite a time in the 2 years I was there. There were a lot of prison disturbances during the time. I ended up spending the last 6 months in segregation in the hole. And back then it was bread and water, like a board on a slab of cement in a cell with a hole in the floor. Every 15 days at max, they had to take you out and give you 3 full meals for 3 days. So I went back and forth between the hole, and there was a seg unit on the other side of the hole in PA. Or SAS Pen. When I say PA, I'm the Saskatchewan Penitentiary I'm talking to. So I was released from the hole. I was pretty angry. And not in great shape either. 6 months in isolation. I was talking to myself and things like that. Anyway, as I say, I was pretty angry. And I didn't get very much help when I got out. I thought it was humiliating. The John Howard Society and groups like this really didn't provide anything. I needed work clothes, boots. I had nothing. Like they sent me to like a Salvation Army used clothing thing and stuff like that. I just found it really humiliating, and I was not in great spirits after my experience. So one thing led to another, and I went back into the group in the neighborhood. And about a year later, I got charged with bank robbery, and I got a 10-year sentence. It was during that 10-year sentence and all the violence that was going on. PA was a pretty violent place. Prisoner on prison violence, a lot of it. And I decided, no, I'm not spending my life here. I had a friend who had got out. He'd just done 12 years, and he did most of it. He did 8 on it, or 9. And he was out like a month, and he got arrested for bank robbery and got another 12 years. And I remember sitting to myself thinking, I'm not spending my life in here. And so what could I do about it? So I had to finish a couple of courses for high school, though I had finished most of my grade 12. And then just through a fluke, there was a young guy that came in to work as a classification officer one summer, and we had a Toastmasters International speaking group in PA that I was the educational chairman for. And we always had, because we had outside guests, we always had to have somebody from the administration sit into the meetings. And generally it was somebody from the classification department, not a screw. And so this young guy sat in, and I got to know him, and he knew I was interested in school, and he was from Kingston. When he got home, I got a letter from him saying, did I know that you could take correspondence courses from Queen's University? And so he sent me, we corresponded, he sent me all the application forms, and I applied, and I was accepted. And they let me take 2 courses, and I did quite well on those. And then the next year they let me take 3, and I passed all those. And the change, I guess, in my behavior inside seemed really noticeable to the authorities. And that kind of coupled with Trudeau had just really come into government. His idea for a just society and all his pronouncements there. If you look at parole statistics, you'll find there's a real increase in late 60s, early 70s. And it lasts for about 2 or 3 years where the parole rates really go up and then they go down again. And so I was lucky. I got into that burst. Taking courses from Queens, quite a few other guys in the joint also started to take courses. In the end, there was like 5 of us that were at Queens doing various things. I have one friend that was into computers. That was in 1970. Like, I wonder, wow, where did he go and what did he do? Because he was really into it back then. And, you know, one thing led to another. I think what you want to talk about really in many ways when you talk about the 60s. 60s were it's a funny era in Canadian penal history. By 1960, the penal reform movement had really started to peter out. And there were real problems with it. Maybe what I really need to do is to go back and give you a little basis of the history of that. I don't think you can understand it clearly without it. There were major riots in the 1920s and 1930s in Canadian penitentiaries. And it produced a bigger report in 1921, I think. But then there was a major disturbance at Kingston Penitentiary in the mid-1930s. And Tim Buck and a number of others that were members of the Communist Party had been outlawed, and members of it were incarcerated. And I think they're all doing 5 years for being members of a legal organization. The idea behind the legislation was that they were promoting violent overthrow, and anybody promoting violence in politics, so this was their excuse anyway. But the thing was Tim Buck and this group were really tied into trade unions in the Labour Council in Toronto. specifically. And so they had a lot of support, and there was a lot of outside agitation around their arrest and around their incarceration. So Buck was involved. There's I really recommend it. There's Years in the Struggle, which is a biography of Tim Buck that is really useful. It gives you a lot of information on his experience, carceral experience, but also in the criminalization of politics in this country in the 1930s. Buck being in KP at the time of these disturbances, and the military took over. They were shooting into people's cells. There was the rumor was they tried to assassinate Tim Buck. So this led to, as I said, because of the support out of labor unions and the Trade Council in Toronto, it led to a fair amount of publicity. And there was a fellow named Winthrop who wrote a memoir that was published around the same time. Winthrop was a doctor who was doing abortions, which were illegal, and a woman died. He was found guilty of being involved, and he was sentenced to 3 years, I believe, in KP. And so when he was there, he was very well educated, very articulate, literate. He wrote a book when he got out, and it came out around the same time and had great impact. Globe and Mail presented large excerpts from it, and so there was quite a bit of public agitation. And you got to remember the 1930s, the Great Depression. There was a lot more grassroots agitation going on. There was a much stronger sense of community of the left, of against state repression, against authoritarianism. So this had quite an impact in terms of Canadian society. And finally, the government, there had been Bennett, the Tories, had been in control with Bennett as Prime Minister at the beginning of the 30s, and he screwed up or they screwed up the economic situation for most people to such an extent that they were thrown out the next election, and a Liberal government came in who were more open to these arguments from the Labour Council and the like. And so they created the Archambault Report, or the Archambault Commission, which was an investigation into the situation in Canadian penitentiaries. There were 9 at the time across the country. And the Archambault Report became a blueprint for penal reform in Canada, where they argued that they really referred to it as the New Deal, as Roosevelt had in the U.S. for the broader economic situation. And I guess the mantra of it all was that prisoners are people. And so there was this argument that they had to liberalize penal regimes and penal control to some extent. We still have the silent system, the regular beatings, like the amount of the use of the paddle, the use of physical punishments, the whole bread and water diets was really rampant across the system. So the Second World War really put off the changes, though they did start to occur. There were a lot less guards during the war because of the military call-up and the like, and a lot less prisoners coming in. So they kind of loosened it up. The silent system in many places was falling apart. They'd already started to loosen things a little bit. So it was after the war. They established a commission, or a commissioner's office. A guy named Gibson, who was a retired military officer, was the first commissioner. And they started a program of penal reform. It went in fits and starts from the late 40s through to the 1960s. And certainly there were real improvements in terms of recreation possibilities, of just being out of your cell. They tried to put in vocational training and educational opportunities, but in a really half-hearted way. And in most institutions, it really was barely possible. So by 1960, this initiative started to peter out. And if you look at the penal press, what prisoners are calling for at the time is for them to fulfill the promises they made, like to go full tilt with it. Are we doing this penal reform? Are we trying to do rehabilitation or not? And there was within the staff of the penitentiaries themselves, there was a lot of digging your heels in and not wanting to go along with it. One of the arguments that the commissioners made, and Archambault and the like, was the lack of trained personnel working within penitentiaries. I mean, who wanted to be a prison guard? The pay was shit. You'd be treated like dirt by senior people and screamed at by convicts. Like, who wants to be a prison guard? It's one of the reasons that a lot of the penitentiaries were out-of-way places. And you see later, they actually built prisons in places like Drumheller and Alberta and Springhill, Nova Scotia, to give an economic boost to areas. It's one of the places they could actually get people to work. So the 1960s were this middle ground where headquarters had wanted to keep going, prison staff were digging their heels in, and prisoners themselves were saying, hold on, you promised us this, none of it is happening. And so there started to be more disturbances, more, not huge kinds of riotous situations that had occurred in the 50s, but also primarily in the 30s, but disturbances nonetheless. So when I went into PA, you had these two things going on. I remember like that's major resistance, like and pushing other people to stand up and not take it. We had work stoppages. We refused. They put me in the masons, and guys were destroying the machinery that made bricks. Like, I don't think that machine ever worked for more than 2 days running before somebody cut all the wires, and that was happening in all the shops. So there were a lot of these just everyday resistance activities going on. And when I think back on it, I think you have to understand it was the 1960s. And what was going on outside affected what went on inside. And in many ways, we were the same people. One of the things that, when I look back, was really quite surprising, or not, I'm not sure, was how young we all were. And a lot of the people raised in hell in South Penn, we were all like teenagers or early 20s. And so I think we were all influenced by what went outside. So the 70s became a major era of disturbances and prisoner resistance. As I said, you've got to understand it as instigated by guards, that the guards' attitudes and their contestation of headquarters control and rehabilitation program, they were really against it, and the union put the worst of the worst in terms of the guards, I like to use that formulation, in control of the union and in control of what went on in institutions. I used to have a guy that had been a guard at Millhaven come in and talk to my classes. He got squeezed out. They slashed his tires, things like this. He talked about being a guard at Millhaven and the excruciating nature of it if you were a guard. They ran the guy who was the warden. They ran his car off the road one night. So Millhaven exploded. And I think the really important thing in terms of resistance, what I'd like to talk about, and it worries me that it seems not to be there to the extent it once was, is Prison Justice Day. Guys in Millhaven, Howie Brown, being a principal, started the group called the Odyssey. And they were really about prisoners' rights. And they were a prisoners' rights group. And they brought in, there were 15 members of the group. The group voted on who was members, who got to be members. They could bring in 15 outsiders. And so outsiders did come in. The Ottawa Civil Liberties Group, Liz Elliott and Ray Sundstrom were principals. They were major supporters. So Millhaven, the Odyssey group, a guy named Eddie Nayland you probably know all this, Eddie Nellen committed suicide in the hole on August 10th, 1974. Following year, Bobby Landers, and I did time with both Bobby and Glenn Landers at PA. They were, like I said before, they were the crew of us, really young. I counted like 77 guys from my neighborhood. Prison, like in Edmonton, was where I've been living at the time of all my troubles. So in Millhaven, Bobby Landers died of a heart attack in the hole. They're in the special handling unit. He'd been transferred in about 3 weeks before. I don't know from where. So they started on August the 10th, 1975. They had a day of fasting, a hunger strike, day of non-work, to memorialize the death of Eddie Nellen. And it led to the creation of Prison Justice Day. And one of the things, if you're talking about prisoners' resistance, and I think this was really important. What we did from the 1960s to the 70s was we had access to outside visitors, and we always tried to bring in, people from the universities, people from newspapers, people that had some kind of influence in the community. And so that's pretty much what Odyssey did. It reached out. And if you look at the penal press, if you look at a lot of prisoners' resistance, what they try to do, it's really central, is to talk to the outside public. There's this, I think, false belief myself, illusion, that if people knew what was going on inside, they'd stop it. I'm not sure that's the case. But prisoners do have that optimism. They can't believe what goes on around them. And if they figure if, that solid square John out there knew, they'd be against it, that they would do something about it. So the Odyssey group really reached out to the broader community and brought in people like Claire Culhane. I do want to talk a little bit about Claire Culhane. So Prison Justice Day started within a year. Prison for Women, P4W, by 1976. They claimed 98% of the women in P4W supported the Memorial Day, and a day of not eating, of hunger. It was a wide complement of outside support. Prisoners' Rights Committee of Montreal, the ODD, the Quebec Human Rights League, all in 1976 started demonstrations and support. I believe the ODD actually all didn't eat that day as well. They engaged in the same kind of activities. Marie Beemans, I think, was one of the people involved there. I don't remember everybody's names, but I knew them all. The Quebec Human Rights League provided support. In Vancouver, the wondrous Claire Culhane and her prisoners' rights group started to do demonstrations outside of Ocala. Claire's a major feminist, so she was really concerned about women's imprisonment in Ocala, and she started major actions around Prison Justice Day in Vancouver. In my lifetime, and I've been active since I was a boy, Claire is the social justice activist that I've ever met. Her level of dedication, her involvement over the years, the things that she was involved in starting. She tried to go to Spain in the 1930s. She was like 17 years old, 18 years old. They told her, hey, girl, you're too much of a kid. So she helped organize fundraising for a Norman Bethune tour that came through. Claire was from Montreal. So Claire, maybe more than anybody, has influence on the spread of Prison Justice Day, both inside and outside. The thing about Claire, St. Clair, as convicts called her, was that she went to every federal penitentiary twice a year. And she had correspondence from people in all the joints. So she became a connecting point for everybody, all of us, those of us outside, people inside. So not only was she totally knowledgeable, but she was able to pull all these things together. And I remember when she chained herself to the doors of Parliament, like in a demonstration out in the Hill. She used to come through here, and I had her at the university all the time. And we worked pretty close together. But God, she'd leave, and you'd feel like really inadequate, like you really hadn't done anything. What would you'd been doing, and so you got this great burst of energy from her all the time, and this, come on, Bob, let's go. I remember she got arrested because the post office claimed she used to reuse envelopes, just like scrawl over and put in new. They accused her of reusing stamps. And so we had a prisoners liaison group at the university, student group, and we used to go down to Collins Bay, and lifers group and what have you down there. So they raised money for stamps. I think they raised like $400 and some to buy her stamps so she wouldn't get arrested. But so Claire was really central in developing the national scope of Prison Justice Day, both inside and outside. And then the screws, the guards, the administration, they were helpful as well. So what they did was they took principal people from Odyssey, like Howie Brown, and they transferred them. So they sent Howie to British Columbia Penitentiary. No, maybe they sent him east. They sent George Watson to British Columbia Penitentiary. Anyway, what they sent key people to other joints who could then share their knowledge of organization and what have you in these other venues. So Prison Justice Day, I think, was the major initiative of prisoners' resistance in the 1970s, and it really did. It really did pull in outside people, and that was their desire. I wanted to read you this. This is what the Odyssey group is about. Prison Justice Day, August 10th, 1979. For the end of senseless deaths in prison, in support of human rights for prisoners, to attain the right to meaningful work with fair wages, the right to useful education and training, the right to proper medical attention, the right to freedom of speech and religion, the right to free and adequate legal services, the right to independent review of all prison decision-making and conditions, the right to vote, the right to form a union, the right to adequate work and fire safety standards, the right to open visits and correspondence, the right to natural justice and due process. Those are the demands that Odyssey Group in their magazine presented as their position, what their group was about, what Prison Justice Day was about. And so what you had, and I really saw it as coming out of the 60s, the wider initiatives that had occurred in outside community in terms of, I guess, a left politics, certainly a wider critical politics. It wasn't just about prisons, but connected to the bigger picture itself and located prisons within the larger capitalist structures of control and social discipline.
Thanks for listening to the first episode of What Happened to Prisoner Justice Day, a podcast mini-series about the history of prisons in Canada, focusing on differences in the prison system in the 1960s to 1980s versus today. You can read more about the history of PJD by checking out a project Bob started called the Journal of Prisoners on Prisons, or the JPP. They're online at jpp.org. Our next episode will feature Poppy, who spent time in prisons in Ontario and Quebec, and talks about what it felt like in the early days of PJD on the inside, as well as changes to the prison discipline regime and their effects.